April 20th, 1945. The Brenner Pass, high in the Italian Alps. The war in Europe is in its final, desperate days. But for 1B-17 crew, the war is about to end in a fireball of twisted metal. Their bomber has been shredded by German flak. The electrical system is dead. The hydraulics are gone. And the bomb bay doors, massive sections of metal designed to open and close, are now jammed wide open, creating a wall of drag that is tearing the aircraft apart. Pause. They are deep in enemy territory, losing altitude and running out of time. First Lieutenant Allen Rhodes Gregory, a 26-year-old pilot with the 416th Bombardment Squadron, is flying his 30th combat mission. His target, the strategic railroad marshalling yards in the Brenner Pass, the last supply route for German forces in Italy. But as his formation runs the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, a shell finds its mark. What happens next will force Gregory to make a 90-second decision that defies every manual, every training film, and every instinct for self-preservation. He must choose: order his men to bail out over enemy territory, or attempt to fly a crippled fortress home with its bomb bay doors locked open. A decision that will determine whether 10 men live or die. By April 1945, the German army in Italy was in full retreat. The Allies had broken through the Gothic line and were pushing north toward the Po Valley. But the Germans still had one lifeline: the Brenner Pass. This narrow corridor through the Alps connected Italy to Austria and Germany, funneling troops, fuel, and ammunition to the crumbling front lines. If the Allies could cut that line, the German resistance in Italy would collapse. The 99th Bomb Group, part of the 15th Air Force, was tasked with severing that artery. Based in southern Italy, their B-17 flying fortresses were the only aircraft with the range and payload to strike deep into the Alps. First Lieutenant Allen Rhodes Gregory, known to his friends as Greg, was a flight leader in the 416th Bombardment Squadron. He had already flown 29 missions over some of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. This was to be his 30th, his ticket home. The morning of April 20th dawned clear over the Italian airfields, good bombing weather. Gregory's crew gathered for the briefing. The target was the marshalling yards at the Brenner Pass, a bottleneck where trains loaded with German reinforcements were massing. It was a critical target, but it was also a deadly one. The pass was ringed with anti-aircraft batteries, German 88mm guns that had turned the narrow valley into a kill zone. Gregory knew the risks. He had seen too many friends go down. But this was his last mission. 30 missions and you were done. You went home. Pause. All he had to do was survive one more flight. At dawn, the bombers roared to life. Gregory's B-17, laden with a full bomb load, lifted off the runway and joined the formation climbing north over the Adriatic Sea. The weather was perfect, unlimited visibility. As they approached the Italian coast and turned toward the jagged peaks of the Alps, Gregory could see the snow-capped mountains glistening in the morning sun. It was beautiful, and it was about to become a nightmare. By 1,000 hours, the formation was approaching the Brenner Pass. The bombers descended to their bombing altitude, threading the needle between mountain peaks that rose on either side. The Germans knew they were coming. As the lead bombers entered the pass, the sky erupted. Pause. Flak. Dozens of batteries, firing in coordinated barrages, filled the narrow valley with black puffs of deadly shrapnel. For the men in the bombers, there was no evasive action possible. In the tight formation required for accurate bombing, they had to fly straight and level, presenting a perfect target to the guns below. The flak was so thick that gunners could smell the burnt gunpowder through the cracks in the fuselage. Shell fragments pinged off the aluminum skin like hailstones on a tin roof. And then, Gregory's bomber took a direct hit. The shell exploded just beneath the bomb bay. The concussion slammed the aircraft upward. Red warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. The electrical system flickered and died. The hydraulic pressure gauge, the same gauge that had betrayed so many crews before, spun wildly and then dropped to zero. Gregory fought the controls as the bomber bucked and shuddered. He called out to his crew. Damage report. Who's hit? The flight engineer checked the systems. Number 3 engine is damaged, sir. Losing oil pressure. Electricals gone. Hydraulics are out. And then came the worst news. The bombardier's voice crackled over the intercom, barely audible above the rushing wind. Lieutenant, the bomb bay doors. They're jammed open. I can't close them. Pause, jammed open. In the bomb bay. To understand the danger, one must understand the aerodynamics of AB-17. The bomb bay doors, when closed, are smooth and streamlined. When open, they act as massive air brakes, creating enormous drag. The B-17 was never designed to fly any distance with the doors open only during the few seconds of the bomb run. Now, Gregory's bomber was flying with a barn door hanging in the slipstream. The airspeed bled off rapidly. The bomber fell behind the formation. Gregory watched as the rest of the squadron pulled away, their silver wings shrinking into the distance. He was alone now. Alone over the Brenner Pass, with a damaged engine, no hydraulics, and bomb bay doors locked open. The oxygen system had been ruptured by the flak. They couldn't stay at high altitude. Gregory pushed the yoke forward and began a slow descent, dropping toward the valley floor, hoping to find enough airspeed to stay airborne. The numbers were grim. With the doors open, the B-17 could barely maintain 125 miles per hour, far below its normal cruising speed. At that speed, over mountainous terrain, the bomber was a sitting duck. Any German fighter that spotted them could circle around and attack at will. And they were deep in enemy territory, with hundreds of miles to cover before reaching the safety of the Adriatic. Gregory had a choice. He could order his 9 crewmen to bail out. They were over the Italian Alps, but the Germans were below. If they parachuted down, they would almost certainly become prisoners of war. The war was weeks from ending, but weeks in a POW camp could feel like years. Or worse, they could be shot by German troops before they even hit the ground. The other option was to try to fly home. But with the doors open, the bomber was a crippled bird. Gregory called his navigator forward. Can we make it? The navigator calculated the distance, the fuel remaining, the slow airspeed. His expression said everything. It would be close, impossibly close. They would have to fly at low altitude, hugging the terrain to avoid detection, burning precious fuel against the drag of the open doors. And even if they reached the coast, they still had to land. With no hydraulics, the brakes would be useless. Gregory made his decision. They were going home. He banked the bomber away from the mountains and set a course for the south. The crew braced themselves for a long, slow flight. Every minute, every mile was a gift. The damaged engine coughed and sputtered, threatening to fail entirely. Gregory coaxed it along, nursing the throttles, keeping the bomber just above stall speed. Pause, little did they know, the worst was yet to come. The open bomb bay doors were not just slowing them down. They were stressing the entire airframe. The B-17's fuselage was designed to withstand enormous forces, but the constant vibration and buffeting from the open doors was twisting the aircraft in ways the engineers never anticipated. Gregory could feel it in the controls, a shudder, a flex, a sense that the bomber might tear itself apart at any moment. In the bomb bay, the wind screamed through the open doors at over 100 miles an hour. The empty bomb racks rattled and shook. The bombardier, who had to crawl through the bay to reach his position, stared at the twisted metal and knew that any attempt to close the doors manually would be suicide. The mechanism was destroyed. Those doors were staying open until and unless they landed. For 3 agonizing hours, Gregory flew on. The fuel gauges dropped. The damaged engine held, against all odds. The crew scanned the skies for German fighters, but none appeared. Perhaps the Luftwaffe was too busy retreating. Perhaps they simply didn't see the lone bomber limping along at treetop level. Whatever the reason, Gregory and his men were given a chance. And then, finally, the blue water of the Adriatic appeared ahead. By 1400 hours, Gregory's battered B-17 was crossing the Italian coast, leaving enemy territory behind. But the crisis was far from over. Ahead lay their home airfield in southern Italy. And waiting for them on that runway was a problem Gregory had been dreading for 3 hours, landing with no brakes. The hydraulic system that operated the bomb bay doors also powered the brakes. With the hydraulics destroyed, Gregory had no brakes. None. A B-17 landing at high speed without brakes would roll for thousands of feet. If the runway was too short, if he touched down too fast, if anything went wrong, the bomber would overrun the end of the field and crash. Gregory keyed his mic, "Mayday, mayday. This is B-17 requesting emergency landing clearance. Hydraulics out. No brakes. Repeat, no brakes." In the control tower, the controllers sprang into action. The runway was cleared. Crash crews were alerted. Fire trucks and ambulances, the same meat wagons that haunted every pilot's nightmares, took their positions alongside the runway. Every man on the base knew what no brakes meant. It meant a high-speed ground loop. It meant a fireball. Gregory circled the field once, assessing his options. The runway stretched out below him, a ribbon of concrete about a mile long. In a normal landing with brakes, that was plenty of room. But without brakes, at 90 miles an hour, that mile would disappear in seconds. He would have to touch down as slowly as possible right at the very threshold of the runway, and then pray. The crew took their crash positions. The gunners moved away from their stations, bracing themselves against the bulkheads. The flight engineer crouched behind the cockpit, his eyes wide. Gregory turned to his co-pilot. "When we touch down, I'm going to try to ground loop her. It's the only way to stop." Ground looping, deliberately throwing the bomber into a violent spin at the end of the landing roll. It was a desperate move, one that could just as easily flip the aircraft and kill them all. At 1,430 hours, Gregory lined up with the runway. He reduced the throttles. The damaged engine whined in protest. The bomber descended, flaps extended, nose high. The runway rushed up to meet them. Pause, the wheels touched down with a puff of smoke. The B-17 was on the ground. But it didn't stop. It couldn't stop. With no brakes, the bomber rolled on, eating up runway at terrifying speed. Gregory fought to keep it straight, using the rudder, using what little engine power remained. The end of the runway rushed toward them. The fence. The fields beyond. They were going to overshoot. Gregory made his 90-second decision. He jammed the throttles forward on one engine and pulled them back on the other. The bomber lurched, yawing violently to the left. The tires screamed. The airframe groaned. Gregory was deliberately throwing his aircraft into a ground loop, using asymmetric power to spin the bomber around on its landing gear, bleeding off speed through friction and centrifugal force. The B-17 spun like a top. The left wing dipped dangerously close to the concrete. The landing gear, already weakened by the mission, threatened to collapse. Inside the cockpit, Gregory and his co-pilot were thrown against their harnesses, the world a blur of spinning sky and ground. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the bomber would flip, cartwheeling down the runway in a ball of fire. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The B-17 came to rest, angled across the runway, its nose pointing back toward the approach end. Dust and smoke swirled around the fuselage. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Pause, and then the realization set in. They were alive. They were on the ground. And the bomber was still in one piece. The hatches burst open. The crew of Gregory's B-17 spilled out onto the concrete, their legs shaky, their faces streaked with grime and sweat. They stood there, blinking in the afternoon sun, staring at the bomber that had nearly killed them. The crash crew skidded to a halt nearby, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. No fire. No explosion. Just a battered B-17 sitting crooked on the runway, its bomb bay doors still hanging open like a wounded bird. First Lieutenant Allen Rhodes Gregory climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the wing. He looked at the damage, the shredded engine, the twisted bomb bay doors, the hydraulic fluid still leaking onto the concrete. And he knew that he had done something extraordinary. In 90 seconds of desperate airmanship, he had saved his crew. Every single man. Alive. The ground crews who swarmed the aircraft could hardly believe what they were seeing. The bomb bay doors were so damaged that they would never close again. The hydraulic system was a wreck. The number 3 engine was held together by hope and prayer. And yet, the main structure of the aircraft, the wings, the fuselage, the landing gear, had held. Gregory's skill, his coolness under fire, his decision to ground loop rather than risk the overrun, it had worked. Later that day, Gregory sat down for his debriefing. He told the intelligence officers about the flak, the damage, the long flight home, and the landing. They listened in silence, taking notes. When he finished, one of the officers looked up. "Lieutenant, that was your 30th mission, wasn't it?" Gregory nodded. "Then you're done," the officer said. "You're going home." For his actions on that April afternoon, First Lieutenant Allen Rhodes Gregory was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read, in part, "With great skill and cool presence of mind, he was able to return the plane and crew to the home field. His skill and coolness throughout the entire flight was responsible for the safe return of plane and crew." Pause. High praise from an Air Force that rarely gave such credit lightly. The bomber itself never flew again. The damage was too extensive. But that didn't matter. The aircraft had done its job. It had brought 10 men home from their last mission. It was scrapped for parts, its metal recycled into other machines that would continue the fight until the final days of the war. But Gregory's decision, that 90-second gamble on the runway, became legend in the 416th Bombardment Squadron. Just weeks later, on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The men of the 15th Air Force, the bomber crews who had fought their way up the boot of Italy and through the Alps, finally laid down their arms. For Gregory and his crew, the war was over. They had survived. They were among the lucky ones. Thousands of other bomber crews never made it home. Today, the Brenner Pass is a peaceful corridor through the Alps, crowded with tourists and trucks. The flak batteries are gone. The bombers are museum pieces. But the story of First Lieutenant Allen Rhodes Gregory and his 90-second decision lives on, a testament to the skill, the courage, and the sheer determination of the men who flew the flying fortresses. Gregory returned to civilian life after the war, but he never forgot that April afternoon. He never forgot the sound of the flak, the feel of the controls as the bomber fought him, the split-second decision to ground loop rather than give up. He carried those memories with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that sometimes, in the most desperate moments, ordinary men can do extraordinary things. Pause. All it takes is 90 seconds of courage. The story of Allen Rhodes Gregory is just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Every bomber that took to the skies carried 10 men with 10 stories of fear, of courage, of survival, and of sacrifice. Most of those stories have been forgotten, lost to time. But here at World War II Records, we believe they deserve to be remembered. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to Untold War Stories as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.